Welcome to our second session of Love Data Week. If you're not familiar, Love Data Week is all about spreading awareness and the importance of research data management, sharing, preservation, and reuse. We have a week of events this week, so webinars are happening every day at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, so we hope you can join us. This year, we are focusing on practical resources and tips for helping you and researchers at any stage implement good data practices. So be sure to register for all the upcoming events. I will throw the link where you can register for the other events into the chat. Just some logistics, you are encouraged to ask questions and participate throughout. We will have some interactive questions, I believe, throughout today's session. So please mute yourself unless you are asking a question, and then there will be a quick feedback survey at the end, and we would love your feedback. So to get started, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Katie Micah, who is going to take us through Harvard Dataverse, finding, reusing, and citing data. We are both members of the Harvard Library Research Data Management Program at Harvard University. We help our community understand research data services, research data practices, and resources. And specifically, Katie works with Harvard Dataverse. So just quickly, we do have some learning objectives for today's session. We'll hopefully be able to apply some general data finding principles and Harvard Dataverse specific strategies for your research. You'll be able to evaluate data on Harvard Dataverse suitable for reuse, and then cite data according to best practices that Katie will outline for us. So I will now turn it over to Katie.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Give me a second while I get my screen shared. Julie, that looks good?
Yeah, looks great.
Wonderful. Okay, so as Julie mentioned, I am Katie Micah. I'm the data services librarian with Harvard Library, and I also work over at the Institute for Quantitative Social Science with the Dataverse curation team, Harvard Dataverse curation team. Let me just I feel like you always have to organize your window just the right way when you're doing a Zoom presentation. Okay, so at the beginning, I kind of have a few slides to orient the talk and kind of get us going. And then I'm going to move over to Harvard Dataverse itself and just do some kind of live demo-y types of data finding and evaluating activities. So you'll get a really good hands-on, if you wish, kind of tour of Harvard Dataverse from the perspective of finding and evaluating data, less so from publishing, which I think people are usually a little bit more used to when they first interact with Harvard Dataverse. Okay, so I like to start with kind of an overview of what a data repository is and how it's different from other data sharing tools. I like this definition from the National Library of Medicine because it's very concrete. You definitely know what it's saying. It's not a vague concept. But basically, a data repository is a place or a tool that stores data, makes it available to use and download, and organizes it logically. Data repositories can be designed for specific subjects, they can be generalist, or they can be institutionally based. Some might have specific restrictions on what types of files they accept, who is allowed to deposit on that repository platform, or what disciplines it will accept data from. So if we're talking about what a data repository is not a couple things also. It's not a cloud. So while you can, upload and download things from Harvard Dataverse, it's not meant for active use so much the way that something like Google Drive or Dropbox would work a lot better for sharing data with collaborators or colleagues, kind of when you're in the middle of a project or want to share data more informally. It's also not a dark archive. So everything in Harvard Dataverse is backed up on both tape and disk long-term storage, but the repository itself is meant to showcase research artifacts that are intended to be reused again. It's not a data lake or a database or a server farm. While all of these elements kind of work together with Harvard Dataverse, depending on your scenario or your research project, it really is fundamentally a data repository meant for publishing and finding data artifacts. Harvard Dataverse is an open data repository that accepts data from anybody in the world, from any discipline, any type of data, any file format, anything you wish, as long as it can loosely be understood as data, we'll take it. It's an installation of the open source software Dataverse project, which enjoys a pretty large and diverse community of developers and users. As of this morning, we have 67 installations, which means that other Dataverse repositories exist to serve different communities and have different data needs than the Harvard Dataverse community specifically. I like this diagram because it illustrates the organization of Dataverse collections, datasets, and files. So if you see over here on the left, you have a Dataverse collection, and that can include datasets, obviously, but it can also include other Dataverse collections. So, an analogy or a metaphor that I think makes the most sense for this is thinking of a Dataverse collection as a directory structure or as a system of files and folders. So if Dataverse collections are the folders, you can obviously put as many folders in a top level folder as you need, but you can also put as many data sets in as you wish also. And then a data set also has specific components too. So a data set is kind of the discrete unit of a piece of data, of a data project, or kind of the discrete shareable element, so to speak. And you can put multiple data files in a data set. You can also put in, and you are encouraged to add documentation and code files also. Another important component is going to be descriptive metadata that will help other users kind of better understand what the contents of your data is, what it was used for, what it was created for, and then also it makes it more findable on the open World Wide Web. And this will make a little bit more sense, I think, in a few minutes when we take a look at some stuff. Okay, so one thing I wanted to mention before we move on, a question that we always get kind of at the top of these talks is sort of, if Harvard Dataverse is completely open, what does that actually mean? So it means that you can publish anything on it that you wish, as long as it's data. And you also receive, for free by default, up to 1 terabyte of space to publish your data. Each individual file can also be up to 2.5 gigabytes. And there's a little bit of flexibility on that. Obviously, we limit the file sizes just because individual files that are larger than 2.5 gigs are not often super usable. So we want to make sure that if you do indeed have a file that is that big, that you are thinking about how it is going to be downloaded and used by someone in the future. And then the terabyte is also kind of a soft limit. So if you have a reason to go above it, you can contact our team and we'd be happy to kind of work out options for that. If you need to go over 1.5 terabytes, I think it would definitely cost a little bit more to pay for, not so much the service, the storage, but kind of the data transfer is what ends up costing us a lot more at that point. So 1 terabyte per person and or project or organization, and then 2.5 gigs per file. Helpful to keep in mind. Okay, so for the rest of this kind of session, I'll be using Harvard Dataverse, which you can access here also at dataverse.harvard.edu. And then another thing that I want to link to in the chat, hang on, let me type it. Is our demo website. So demo.dataverse.org is going to be a demo installation that is used for all sorts of testing things. So it has all of the latest up-to-date features. So anytime we release a new version, we also update the demo site. And that's kind of designed to allow you to just test your heart out, put on whatever content you want, and kind of figure out how you want to organize things before you put things on the kind of production, archive Harvard Dataverse. So keep that in mind while you are testing things out. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to Harvard Dataverse. This is the homepage. We decided not to bring you immediately to our all data page because it can be a little overwhelming if you're not familiar with the architecture yet. So you kind of get this landing page that gives you some options on adding data sets, adding Dataverse collections, other information for getting started with the repository. You have a search bar, which we're going to dive right into in a second, but I also wanted to highlight that you can browse by subject. So if you have a general sense of what you are looking for data on or about, it's worth kind of maybe just checking out the subjects to peek into what some recently created data sets might be in law, for example, or physics. All right, I've got a quick question from Isabel in the chat, so let me take a look at that. Since it can work with other Dataverses and in the subject of the size limit, which would be a problem for sequencing or imaging data, sure. Could it work with something like Geo? There's a few, it works pretty well with external tools. I'm not familiar exactly with Geo specifically, but it does have a suite of a couple different APIs that make it easier to kind of work between, if you're working in one tool, you want to access data on Harvard Dataverse, or the other way around. API connections work pretty well, but maybe at the end we can talk a little bit more about how Geo. Oh, I see. Thanks, Julie. Yes, it's a ultimately, I think large genomics data sets are not super suitable for Harvard Dataverse. I think things like GenBank or something like that are going to be more appropriate usually, which is definitely one limitation, but we have a lot of, there's a lot of different types of repositories that are used for lots of different types of data. This is a generalist repository. It is optimized for tabular data, so that's mostly what we're going to be looking at today. But I think probably definitely get in touch with Julie if you have more questions about how to publish that kind of data, or if you are working with that type of data, how to help it interact with other types of data sets that you might be combining in a research project or things like that. And then also, this talk won't go the full hour, so we can definitely chat a little bit about it at the end. But good question. Okay, so before we dive right in, the last thing I just wanted to highlight is that we also have direct connections to journals. So some journals will suggest that you publish, or will require that you publish your data that goes along with a paper that you're publishing or a publication that you have. And we partner with a couple of different journals to have Harvard Dataverse be that repository. So I can dive into a search string, but I wanted to ask the chat first, since it sounds like people are actually listening, which you never really know if that's true on Zoom. If anybody wants to add a search string that we can investigate on Harvard Dataverse, anything at all, that would be great. Just add it in the chat or unmute yourself. This is casual. I'll wait like 10 seconds. Brain, great one. And feel free to keep going. There will be a few more opportunities we're gonna look at a couple different things. Thanks, Isabel. Bias is okay with me. Okay, so one thing that's pretty great here is that when you enter a search term, you can search really anything in Harvard Dataverse. What it's doing is it's searching Dataverse collections, data sets, and files. It will also accept a simple search term like we have with Brain, but you can also add a query, and you can also use a phrase or something like that. So things that are outlined, items that are returned that are outlined in orange are going to be Dataverse collections. So those are collections of data sets that are kind of contained in a specific organization or a research project or a user's collection space that they've created. Things outlined in blue are going to be data sets, so kind of those discrete, shareable units that we talked about earlier. And then we've got some files, so let's go ahead and uncheck this data set so we can see what some files look like. A live demo is always a little bit risky because you never know how fast it's going to be. Okay, so we have a lot of Dataverse collections. But I just wanted to show you that when you, so it'll also search the files that are in the data sets. And those are going to be outlined in this gray, black type of thing. It's also going to go ahead and highlight where it found your search string, which is pretty helpful to see. These are all in the description because it's a file and we don't have a huge amount of metadata fields to describe files. So I'm going to recheck data sets so we can remember, keep looking at our entire results page. It looks like it's loading. It's trying very hard. Great. So the next thing I kind of wanted to highlight is over here on the left-hand side are all of the facets that are available by default. So there's, a number of them. They will always show the top 5 facets that are populated. So here we can see the year actually goes in order, which is nice in this case. But you can see subject, here are the top 5 subjects associated with our search term brain. We can take a look at all of them by selecting more, obviously, and when you select more, less will pop up, so you can go ahead and collapse it if you need to. I'm going to click on social sciences, so you can filter according to subject, in this case, social sciences. And you'll see it kind of pops up at the top. So that's how you know that you're in that facet. It's helpful to keep kind of an eye on where you are when you're clicking around. I think it's pretty easy to get lost in Harvard Dataverse. So again, it'll kind of show us where our search term popped up here. It looks like the affiliation for the creators is the Donders Institute for Brain, Cognition, and Behavior at Radboud University. So it'll show up in a few different metadata fields, which we'll take a look at in a second. To remove a facet, obviously, you can just click the X. Let's see, let me double check anything else I want to talk about before we look at a specific data set. Yeah, something else that's helpful is to remember that you can sort for results. I'm going to wait for it to finish loading. And then we'll take a look at how you can sort things. Relevance is the default. So it's, according to the sorting algorithm that we have in place. And then you can also sort according to name and then newest or oldest. Newest and oldest can be kind of the most helpful sometimes, especially if you've been, if you saved a search or if you've, done a search several times, then you might want to be sorting by new just to sort of see if anything has popped up in the last few days. Because sometimes, especially with, a term like brain, there's, 500 results. So things might be popping up pretty regularly. The last thing I want to show before we move on is this concept of a harvested Dataverse. So one thing to keep an eye on is metadata source. So you will both get returns from Harvard Dataverse itself and from harvested collections. So harvested means that we have, grabbed records, metadata records from other data repositories, both other Dataverses or Dataverse repositories, so other repositories that use the Dataverse software, but also other repositories that don't use the Dataverse software, but do have kind of a pretty interoperable format of exposing their records. This one, you can see if it's a harvested one by looking at this little icon in the right-hand corner. That's a helpful way to see it. There's also a note on it that will say this data set is harvested from our partners. The link will take you directly to the source of the data. So that means if I click on this, it will take me out of Harvard Dataverse and to Dataverse NL, which is a Dataverse consortium group in the Netherlands. All right, so let's go ahead and look at this Neuronex Bioluminescence Hub Dataverse. So Isabel, you might have to help out with some of the information here because I don't know anything about bioluminescence or much of what this says because I am not a brain scientist or this type of scientist. I am not even confident that this is about brains. But it does seem like it should be because we have some grant agency information. So the Duke Institute for Brain Science Research Incubator Award seems like they would probably be awarding those grants to people in brain science. Okay, Isabel, thanks. Me too. I feel less bad now. So this is great to sort of see on the left-hand side. So when you create a Dataverse collection, you can also add specific facets to your own Dataverse. So when people are searching within it, it's not that useful right here because there's only 7 results. But say you have a collection of, several hundred data sets in a Dataverse collection, it can be useful to add custom facets, especially for things like grant agency information. The grant information, the grant number can be helpful. Things like that can be really useful to keep an eye out for. Let's take a look at, we've got descriptions coming soon. So that's not super helpful. It's nice that they told us that they plan on adding a description. But let's look at this one since it does have a description. Let's see what kind of files it has. All right, so this is sort of the basic idea of what a Dataverse collection looks like. Up here, we can see the affiliation is Brown University. So that's the Dataverse that it's coming from, which is still on Harvard Dataverse. It's this, its Dataverse is all the way down, so to speak. You can also include some branding if you have an icon that you want to make sure you have on your Dataverse collection page. That can be useful. We have a title that is meaningful to some people, less meaningful to others, which is completely fine. If I was consulted on this, I might say it might be good to have a title that other people can read, but it's also a great way to weed out people that are not going to be interested in this data specifically. So the default view is the files page. So it looks like we have a text file, a .dna file, a .jp2 file, and a PDF file. So I like the way that these are all different. It highlights that there is really, Dataverse will accept any type of file that you have. It is completely file agnostic. There is some additional extra support for tabular data. So that can be helpful, but really you can put anything you want on the system and it will accept it. We can take a look at the metadata. So that's really helpful to kind of get a better sense for what the files contain, what the data set really means. In this case, I think the topics are really helpful to keep an eye out for because it looks like all of these keyword terms or these topic terms have been added according to a specific ontology that is managed by NCBI and the National Library of Medicine, the MESH subject headings. So that's really useful to know that these terms are useful depending on what you might want things to describe it. It's some type of guarantee that what the topic says is in fact is more specific than just sort of having a keyword and saying it is generally this. It is not just generally this, but it is specifically this term exactly. So it would be another way to say it for something that I understand a little bit better than CAG promoter is so say you have it's snowing right here. So I'm going to use that as my example. A subject heading, you might have a keyword that you would just say, oh, I'm classifying this according to it's snow. But if you think about snow a little bit harder, there's lots of different types of snow. You could have big snowflakes, you could have little snowflakes, such I'm sure have their own specific terms. And so then a vocabulary or subject heading can help you really drill down into identifying the exact specific thing that you are describing. So those are useful to keep an eye out for. It's also helpful to look out for links to other things. So getting to this bioluminescence hub can be helpful to learn a little bit more about the project in general. It sounds like, according to this kind of Dataverse collection, that it is a large project that has generated quite a few data sets already. So maybe their website, the BL Hub, has a lot more information about the project, about some of their research, and what's going on a more updated way. One more thing to keep an eye out for is terms of use. So it looks like this group has applied a Creative Commons attribution non-commercial license. So what that means is that you can reuse this data for any non-commercial reason that you want. So as long as you're not making money off of it, and as long as you attribute the authors properly. I'm going to go ahead and kind of skip ahead a little bit. It's helpful when you see this attribution flag for licensing to remember that there is a citation that is automatically generated on every single data set to enable really high quality data citations. So when you use a data set from Harvard Dataverse or from anywhere, it really is best practice to cite it the same way that you would cite literature in your references list. Some publications, some journals obviously are going to require that you also put it in somewhere like supplementary information or a specific data resources section. But it is also a really good idea to kind of use a very standard citation format, including this DOI, to facilitate access to these data, the correct version, long into the future. You can export these citations, which is really useful to keep an eye out for. RIS is the type of format that is used with reference managers like Zotero. Zotero is the one I use the most. Fun fact about the RIS file format is that nobody manages anymore. It's just sort of out in the wild, and we continue to use it, and it seems to keep working very well, but it is not owned or updated or managed in any way by anybody, which I was shocked to find out about. But fun fact that sometimes if you just keep using things, they will continue to work. And then of course, BibTech. All right, I think guest books are something to keep an eye out for also. I think in some cases, for some data sets, the owner of the data set might require that you, before downloading something, you provide a name or an email address or a reason for using the data set, just to kind of keep an eye out for making sure that their terms of use are being adhered to, that the licenses are being followed. Sometimes they use them for reporting purposes, so it's helpful to know kind of how many universities or you know, which affiliations people are from that are downloading the data. That can be useful for reporting statistics for some of these big projects, especially grant-funded projects. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back and take a look at another type of data set. Let's go ahead and, oh wow, there's some great chat in the chat happening. Connection to AdGene, great repository for plasmids. Wonderful, wonderful to know. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do just a quick, simple search for Beagle. Hopefully this gets us some tabular data, which I think can be helpful to see how Harvard Dataverse handles that, since it's a really common type of data. And I have a Beagle, so that's what came to mind. All right, so here, back to our standard search page, the results that we see, it looks like immediately we have some data sets. It looks like we have an author named Emily Beagle. So that's probably not what we're looking for, but if we were, we found her. So that's good to know. And some files. So that's pretty useful. I'm going to go ahead and it looks like, so I can see in this this file that it popped up right here that it is obviously has a .tab extension, but it's also identified as tab delimited. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this one, but I'm not going to go straight to the file. I'm going to actually click on this link right here, which will bring me to the data set that the file is inside of. One thing that's useful to keep in mind is whatever link is immediately below the title of the item that has been returned is kind of the next step up. So on this one up here, here is the title for the data set, and the next step up would be this CIAT, International Center for Tropical Agricultural Dataverse, would be the Dataverse collection that this data set is inside. If you see nothing, let's see, is there anything that isn't anything? Okay, not on this page. But if there isn't a link down there, that means it's just a data set that's on kind of the root Harvard Dataverse page. It's not inside of a Dataverse, which is also another way to publish things. So I'm going to go ahead and go to this replication data for a canine identity crisis, genetic breed heritage testing of shelter dogs. So this has a few things that's helpful to look at immediately. I have a related publication, which is a metadata field that I really, really, really like to see when I'm taking a look at a data set to use. Having the related publication means that I can go back to the article that used this data to sort of see a lot more information about their methodology, their collection protocols, you know, what they use the data for. That can give me a better insight into, you know, what would be another appropriate use of the data. Can I reuse it for what I want to use it for, or will it not actually kind of tell me anything that's, you know, relevant for my research work. So there's a few different ways to access a data set. You can access the entire thing by this top button. You can download the original format or the archival format. Something Dataverse does is converts all tabular data to this .tab format, which is a very, which is an open, you know, archival standard for tabular data. Lots of things will come in, you know, as an Excel spreadsheet. Excel is a primary file format, so that means that you can only open Excel files with Excel. Which is not super great for long-term preservation. So we move everything to .tab. So even if you don't use Excel, you can still open one of these files on whatever software platform you choose. So I can download the whole thing, but I can also, maybe before I download it, I want to see what this data is before I download the whole thing. I like to do this because I hate downloading things onto my machine and then opening them up and looking at them and deciding I don't like them, and then I have some garbage on my computer, which is not, you know, wonderful. So one way to kind of take a look at this is to click on this access file option. Again, I can download these other converted formats that it has generated, that the Harvard Dataverse system has generated. And I can either view it in a kind of, it'll open up in a new tab, or I can use this other tool called Data Explorer. So let's take a look at view data first. And it's really just a spreadsheet viewer. It's helpful to kind of see what the variables are, kind of what some of the values look like. You can get a sense for how big it is, but it's still, you know, not that useful. It's a little overwhelming. You know, there's a lot of variables, so it looks like they've broken them all of the I guess breeds into different columns too. So maybe instead of looking at this entire thing, whoops, the Zoom toolbar is really getting in the way. I'm going to go ahead and try this Data Explorer. So what this does is it kind of gives you a snapshot of what the variables are, their names and their labels. Sometimes they're different. When it's a categorical variable, it will give you the categories, number of categories, minimums and maximums if they are numeric. It looks like on this page, not so much. It's helpful to have missing cases, information about missing cases. It looks like kind of all of these upfront ones have mostly, or if all valid cases, which is helpful to know. But when you get kind of into the breeds, it looks like there's only 2 bloodhounds and 917 missing cases. So it looks like you've kind of a combination of general data for all breeds, and then some of the later variables are going to be more specific to obviously the breeds. So that's kind of helpful to know and to take a look at and to be able to see before downloading the data. With this snapshot, I can kind of see right off the bat, what's helpful to look at. There's also a contact owner button, which is really useful. You can contact the owner of the data set. This button will send an email to the person that deposited this data, or that's listed as the contact person. We get a lot of emails to our support website that or to our support system that say, I want this data, how do I get it? It's restricted or something like that. And it's a little harder for us to help out with those since we don't own all of the data on Harvard Dataverse. So this contact owner button is a much better bet. All right, there's one last thing I wanted to show. I will talk about Hipaa compliance at the end. Maybe Julie can pop in a little bit for that too. And then for each deposit, is there a form of curation, like cleaning metadata, for example? So that's a really good question. As far as cleaning metadata, I think if you want to maybe add a little bit more about what you mean exactly, because when you deposit data, you get a form that sort of says, fill out title, fill out author, fill out some of those topics again. And it gives you the option to, basically just a standard field to type things in. And then, if there's a section for a controlled vocabulary or an ontology to connect to in those classification terms, like we saw, you can add a link to that in there. It will not reconcile the metadata for you. So if you type in an author's name and you misspell it, it will not notice that. So you have to be kind of aware that you are creating, whatever quality of metadata is really on the depositor's is really kind of the depositor's responsibility. We do have a curation team. So if you have any questions about how to add really rich metadata, that team can be a really good support network to reach out to. We can definitely consult on anything related to metadata. We have a couple of real metadata gurus that can be very helpful. There's also one more thing I was going to show, which I think will also maybe illustrate another thing about metadata is this advanced search field. So this is not a talk on depositing data, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about how you create really nice metadata for publishing your data. But this advanced search field gives you a sense for what fields are available. There's a number of additional metadata schemas that are organized into blocks that are created for specific subjects. The subjects right now are life sciences, social sciences and humanities, and geospatial metadata, I believe, and astrophysics and astronomy. So those have kind of specific metadata elements that are available to apply to your data, depending on, if it's a social sciences data, if it's an astrophysics data set. But sort of the default ones are kind of contained in this citation metadata block. So it's sort of things that are going to be applied to all data sets regardless of discipline. So in this advanced search, we can search for really anything in those fields that we see here. We can search files, we can search Dataverse collections, and we can search data sets. I'm going to search Harvard Medical School in the affiliation field and click find and see what we turn up. And then let's take a look. I'm going to filter according to project just to sort of hop through a little bit. Okay, so we've got some interesting ones here. let's take a look at this one. All right, so they created a Dataverse collection and put one data set inside it, which is totally fine. Let's see what's inside this data set. All right, we got 4 files. We have some archive files, which is useful to keep in mind. So you can add tarballs or zipped files, things like that will preserve the hierarchy of a folder when you're adding it. It makes it a little bit less easier to evaluate things from a user perspective, but sometimes keeping everything together can be the best way to handle that. Let's see. So we've got some additional metadata down here. One thing to that can be really helpful is exporting an entire metadata record. I'm going to go ahead and look at this DDI HTML codebook. So this gives us kind of another way of looking at what type of metadata is available, was made available by this researcher. Sometimes the files will also be, depending on what they are, not in this one, I don't think, because they're all archive files, but you will also get some specific file level metadata, which includes the indexing of the variables, which makes the data explorer possible that we saw earlier. So I think it's 12:43, so it turns out I can talk just for ages and ages about finding data on Dataverse. So I think that's good enough for now. I'll keep sharing my screen just in case you want to look at anything. We talked about finding data, so using the searching function. You can use the advanced search to dip into specific metadata fields that you want to search. We talked about evaluating data by taking a look at what the files are, using the data explorer, which can be really helpful. Also trying to read metadata, looking for the related publication can be really helpful. Things like that. And then finally, well, I guess it wasn't finally in this case, it was a little bit before finally, but we did look at citations and how important they are to cite data when you are, publishing something, to make sure that people can make it back to the data set that you used or that you created for your research. One thing to keep in mind with regard to publishing data, even though this isn't a publishing data talk, is license stacking. So we saw one data set that has a CC BY affiliate non-commercial license on it, which is absolutely fine to use. We usually talk about trying to put the most permissive license possible on data, because if someone reuses that data set, they are going to have to republish it with the same license or with a license that is no more permissive than the original one was. And so say it started off as a CC0, completely open public domain data set. Someone used it for a different research project, added a few more variables or created a derived data set from those, and then put a CC BY license on it. That means kind of anyone using, even though the data from the original data set is public domain and can be used for any reason, now if they're using it in this new context, they have to give proper attribution, which is good to do. We should be citing things properly, but it's good to be aware of kind of how things like that can stack up on top of each other. So with that, I will finish up. I did want to, if you have any more questions, feel free to add them in the chat. I will talk a little bit about Hipaa compliance as you are, formulating thoughts. So addressing Hipaa, the question is, could you address Hipaa compliance and if there are options for data that needs security? So for now, Harvard Dataverse is not an appropriate repository for data that has that needs to be restricted, that has a lot of security concerns that might include personally identifying information or things like that. There are options to restrict files, but it does not sufficiently protect against all potential ways of accessing the data. It's not a foolproof type of system. There isn't very good encryption to make sure that those are sufficiently restricted. It's mostly for keeping an eye on who's downloading data, things like that. There's often some medium cases, which is what that restrictions are meant to accommodate. Julie put a great link in the chat for HIPAA and data anonymization. I do want to say that it has been in development for a very long time now, and we are, I think, in the home stretch of applying a new feature called data tags. So right now there's a limited feature where you can, tag a data file. But what data tags will do is it will apply much higher standards of security to different levels of file restrictions. So you can restrict according to, a green level, which would be no restrictions, completely open, an orange level, which would be, some restrictions, a red level, which would be even more restricted, and a black level, which is unavailable in cases, except for cases of, extreme IRB approval and personal access and things like that. The one thing that's kind of that makes that possible is that on the back end, right now, Harvard Dataverse uses mostly AWS for the storage. And so what this new data tags feature will do is it will also make other types of storage available. So if you have, space on a cluster somewhere that, it will be easier to put the record on Harvard Dataverse and then deliver the data from any much higher quality, very secure place that it is stored. So for now, don't put any sensitive data on Harvard Dataverse, but keep an eye out because hopefully in the next year, it will be available as a feature. All right, any other questions? Oh, an RStudio integration with Zotero. I have not heard about that. That is really exciting though. Thanks, Mara. I will look into that more. Okay, I don't see any other questions coming in. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And then I did want to see if Julie wanted to add anything else about the geo data from earlier, because I really cannot speak too much about those.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. Yeah, in some instances, depending on what type of data you're working with, but also where your funding is coming from, your funder may indicate where you need to share your data. So that's where those NCBI repositories that Katie mentioned, like Geo and dbGaP, are going to come into play. They're just more specific repositories that allow those research communities to go to one place and find kind of, that subject data that they're looking for. So it's really going to depend, again, what type of data you're working with, and usually what your funder says is where I like to start. We do have another page on our website that I threw into the chat that looks at some of these general repositories like Dataverse, but then some other options like Dryad and Figshare, and then also lists out. We don't go into all of the NCBI repositories because there are quite a bit, but there is a link there to learn more about those repositories. When finding a repository, it is, Katie can talk to this too, but it's, tricky to find the right place, the right home for your data. So there's kind of, it's a list or a checklist that you have to go through. In some of my other presentations, I've shown that. So you start with your funder, then you look at where your journal says, then you talk to your colleagues and your community about where they share their data. Maybe your institution has a repository, and so on. So there's some questions you need to ask yourself about what type of data you're working with for the right repository for you.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you, Julie. Yeah, I guess the only thing I'll add to choosing a repository is really leaning on other colleagues that you might have in your discipline can be definitely a really fruitful resource. funders are great and their websites are helpful, but yeah, other people I think are often the best to talk to. All right, well, thanks for joining. Oh, it looks like, Julie, you might have another comment in the chat.
Yeah, trying to figure out which link you're talking about. But yeah, I did want to end with a few resources maybe that would be helpful for everyone. So I'll just point to, I've been putting some of these links into the chat, but there are two great websites that may be of use. So the first one is for the research data management program that Katie and I are members of. And you can find some great resources here, especially if you are at Harvard. This is a pretty general place, no matter where you are at Harvard, to come and find the services that are most relevant for you, learn more about Dataverse, some other tools, and then more about the instruction that Katie and I offer. And then I've mostly been putting in links to a specific resource if you are on the Longwood Medical Area campus. This website is specifically for biomedical data. So that's why, for example, when I put the repositories link in there, it is looking at some of those, NCBI resources, because those are more specific for biomedical and biological data. What we just did with this, redid this website, I toured it yesterday. If you joined, lots of great resources for that type of data there. And just to end here, that you can find more resources on our website, and we would love to hear your feedback on today's session and how Love Data Week is going.